Well, we're moving on to chapter 4 of Maurizio's Classical Mythology in Context. This will take us into the first Homeric hymn that we'll look at. There were 31 of those. This one, to Demeter, Homeric hymn number 2, is one of the 4 long Homeric hymns. Most of them are medium or size or shorter. So we're going to look at life and death. We're going to look here how myth reinforces social norms according to the scholarly piece here. And that'll be contrasted to chapter 5, where it's suggested that myth can challenge social norms. We're going to look here to the descent of Ishtar to the underworld. This provides a particular view of going to the underworld to sort of get someone from the account we get in Homeric hymn number 2. And then we're going to look at a particular poem by Rita Dove called that deals with the Persephone theme. So this chapter looks at both Hades and Demeter and Persephone. Hades doesn't get a whole lot of time, but consideration of Hades is worthwhile. Maurizio put him on the cover of the book, which is interesting, and he is the connection between Demeter, the goddess of grain, and her daughter Persephone. So there is this connection between life and death, because you plant people in the ground when you bury them, but you also plant seeds in the ground that then spring up and form new life. So there is this life-death connection seen by the ancients. Hades was the god of the underworld. He is the brother of Poseidon and Zeus, and according to the myth, he got the job of the underworld by there was a lottery. They drew straws or something like that. Zeus ended up winning that. He got first choice and chose the sky. Poseidon got second choice and he chose basically the earthly plane, but mainly the sea. And then Hades basically got stuck with the underworld. There is no indication in the Greek myths that Hades is angry about the fact that he is in the underworld. So this is different than James Wood's Hades in the Disney Hercules movie, where clearly Hades resents the fact that he is stuck in the underworld. He is the ruler of the underworld, and so one of his titles is Zeus of the underworld. Now, Hades is not feared and not evil. Death, to some extent, is feared. And the uncertainty of death is also sort of a concern, because you don't know when you're going to die. But that's also seen as a blessing, because if you did know when you were going to die, right, like if you knew you were going to die in 3 weeks, for sure, then the next 3 weeks, you might enjoy yourself for a little bit to blow off steam, because, gee, I only got 3 weeks left. But as you got closer, it would basically probably paralyze you. So in one sense, not knowing is a good thing. And you might be resentful, right? If you know, like, oh, this guy's going to live to be 90 and I'm going to live to be 25, right? That would be like a reason to be sort of upset. Hades, though, is the god of the underworld. He's the god who sort of rules over the dead. He's not responsible for taking lives, so he's not death. Death may be one of his agents, but he himself is not death. And he's not portrayed as evil. Death isn't even portrayed as evil. He's just sort of merciless, but he's not presented as evil. Right? It's the nature of things. We are mortal. We are prone to die. One of his titles is Polydegmon, which means the receiver of many. Poly means many. There are not really any temples or sanctuaries to Hades. There are some caves that are associated with the underworld, and there may have been some sort of, revering done there. But Hades was not really a god that you revered. right? I mean, you pray to Zeus, you pray to Demeter, you pray to Hera. You don't really pray to Hades, and he's not the patron god of any city. This is a red figure vase showing the abduction of Persephone. This looks in some ways fairly orderly. Persephone is in the chariot, the 4-horse chariot with Hades, and down below on the left there you have a woman, this is presumably Demeter, holding up a torch. It's got 4 like little candle holders, and that's what she's using when she goes around looking for her daughter. It's also what the people who traveled from Athens to Eleusis for the Eleusinian mysteries, they would carry a torch, presumably similar to this. The other figures in the piece, I don't know particularly well, and I on the screen here, it's sort of small. Now, the geography of the underworld, even the concept of the underworld, is sort of different over time. So in the Homeric poems, there's only one clear reference to the underworld, and that is in the Odyssey. People die in the Iliad. It's a war poem. A lot of people die. And they're going to go to Hades' kingdom and all that stuff, but we don't get any real description of it. What we get in the Odyssey, which is the oldest account we have, because Hesiod doesn't really address the underworld either, is that the underworld is depicted as a place where ghosts they inhabit, and the ghosts are basically bored. They live sort of a dull existence because life is where it's at, and when you're dead, you're done with life. There isn't punishment of people who've been sort of bad. There isn't reward really for people who are sort of good. It's basically all the same pretty much for everyone. There are some exceptional people who get a special reward. Some people get to go to the Isle of the Blessed, which presumably is a nice afterlife. But even that is unclear as to how you get there, because one of the people who gets to go there is Menelaus, Agamemnon's brother. And Menelaus is, he's an okay guy, but he's not an exceptional hero. He's not sort of an exceptional character. He just happened to be married to Helen, and Helen, I guess, presumably, is she's more of a hero because her father is Zeus, and maybe that's, he gets a family sort of pass to the Isle of the Blessed. But Agamemnon's stuck in the underworld, and Achilles, who's the greatest of the heroes at Troy, is stuck in the underworld. Heracles gets to sort of escape. And there are some people who, like the great sinners, who are in a place of punishment. But that would be something along the lines of saying something like everyone goes to hell. Hell's not that bad unless you're Hitler or Stalin or some other really awful person, and then, boy, hell's terrible for you. So basically the thing is, you want to live while you're alive, and when you're dead, everything that meant something to you is gone, and so you're just sort of like a shade floating in the wind. Now, later authors, Plato and later authors, do have a judgment where you go and you are personally judged on your life, and then you are rewarded or punished accordingly. For Plato, who presents a case for reincarnation, he argues it's a 1,000-year period of either punishment or reward, and then you get reborn, and presumably you learn through each life, and then you get better. Now, if you're not paying attention, if you don't take some steps, then you'll repeat the cycle, and eventually you'll never come back. You'll be in the awful place. If you keep on getting better, eventually you'll also escape because you've gone through your lives and you kept on getting better. So, but there is the idea of a personal judgment. The Romans, developed that even further. So in Virgil's Aeneid, we have Aeneas in the underworld, and there he sees souls being punished, and they're being punished like we imagine sort of hell, right? So there's this demon jumping around with a big whip, and she's whipping people, and people are screaming in pain, and agony and so forth. And there, it's again, so there's a personal judgment, and you end up either in the Elysian Fields, you've lived a good life, or in Tartarus, you've lived a bad life. And then there are a lot that just sort of are more like the Homeric ghosts. They're just sort of wandering around, neither happy nor in pain. Part of the reason for that in the Roman case is that the Romans, were influenced by the Etruscans who lived north of Rome, just north of Rome, the area called Etruria. And the Etruscans seem to have believed life is beautiful, and then when you die, you go to this awful place that's filled with demons. So basically, like, everyone goes to hell. And the gladiatorial games started as a way for the rich to have at least a guard in the underworld. So in other words, at someone's funeral, if you were wealthy, you'd put on a gladiatorial show, maybe have like 2 or 3 pairs of gladiators, and then the ones who died, but they fought bravely, they would be the ghosts who would defend you. So you would have some defenders in the afterlife. And that sort of image of hell, I think, informs the Christian view of hell, which really develops, as Christianity becomes the key religion in the Roman Empire, right? So in other words, the Christians take over that Roman idea of hell. And then Dante, of course, gives us a very detailed view of the 3-tiered afterlife. There's purgatory, there's hell, or the inferno, and then there's the paradise, the heaven part, right? So there are 3 levels. So the underworld is typically understood to be under the earth, because what do you do with bodies? You bury them, right? So, and even with ashes, you might bury the urn of ashes. So the idea is the dead are underground, therefore that's where their souls go, right? But there is this sense that the souls can, on certain days, come up, and they can mingle with humans. Of course, we can't see them, and during those times, they're sort of welcomed into the community, and there's usually a ritual to send them back, because you don't want them hanging around all year round. The name Pluto, which is the Roman name for the god of the underworld, it comes from a Greek name Pluton, which means wealthy. So why is Hades seen as wealthy? Well, partly because he has this large kingdom, but also because Hades, the underworld, also produces the crops, right? So things grow from underground, and therefore he is the god of bounty. And Hades is often shown with a cornucopia, which is a symbol of bounty. At some point, rivers get added to the underworld. The Styx was always in the underworld, but the other rivers of the underworld seem to get added later. Those 5 rivers are the Styx, which is the river of hate, Phlegethon, the fiery river, Cocytus, the river of woe, Acheron. Acheron's the river of woe, Cocytus the river of wailing, and Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. And if you believe in reincarnation, the river Lethe plays an important part, because what happens is you drink from the water of the Lethe before you're reborn, which explains why you don't remember your previous life, right? If you believe in reincarnation, something has to happen so that you forget your previous life, right? Otherwise, everyone would remember their previous life. The figure of Charon comes in, later than Homer. Charon is the boatman who takes souls across, in some cases the river Styx, in some cases the river Acheron, but takes them across the river from the world of the living to the world of the dead, where of course the guard dog Cerberus won't let them come back out. Hesiod says that Cerberus has 50 heads, but later authors make him a 3-headed dog, and that's how he's usually portrayed. The Elysian Fields or the Elysian Plain, this is the place, the equivalent of heaven. This is where the people who were good go when they die. And this is a place of, it's pleasant. It's like being in a pleasant country field. Now, some equate the Elysian Fields with the Isle of the Blessed. The Isles of the Blessed were thought to be in somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. I like to think that maybe they were thinking of Ireland, but it's partly because of my Irish background. But they were thinking of something far enough out that beyond that must be the edge of the world, right? Because remember, they would have thought of things as a disk. Tartarus is the place of punishment. That's the equivalent of what we consider hell, the place where you go and you're just punished for eternity or for a really long time. So here we have Charon awaiting Hermes, who's got some souls with him. So we get two sides of this. This looks like a perfume flask. And this is neither a black figure or a red figure vase. It's a different type of vase painting altogether. But you can see Charon there. He's got a hat on, and then right next to him is Hermes. How can you tell? Because Hermes has the staff with this top of it looks like an O with two things sticking out of it, two lines sticking out of it. It looks like an O with an umlaut over it. But that is the caduceus, so that's how we know it's Hermes. So in Homer, at any rate, and in later authors, the Greek authors and the Roman authors, the souls in the underworld retain the appearance and personality they had at death. In other words, when Odysseus travels to the edge of the world and meets the ghost of his Trojan compadres, they look like they did when they were at Troy. So he recognizes Agamemnon, he recognizes Achilles, he recognizes Ajax. When Aeneas travels to the underworld, he sees Dido, this queen that he fell in love with. He also sees Deiphobus, who's one of the brothers of Hector. So he sees various people. And now, in the Roman version, the dead look exactly as they did at the moment of death. And so in the case of Deiphobus, he was tortured first. They cut off his ears, they cut off his nose, and so that's the way he looks in the afterlife. Others just look like they would normally have looked. They don't look like their hacked up version. Like Agamemnon does not look all hacked up when Odysseus sees him, although he died by being sort of stabbed repeatedly and with an axe. There are disagreements among the dead in in some authors they have judges, but those judges in Homer, the judges are there, and he, even some others, they are there to judge disputes among the ghosts. They are not judges who judge whether the people lived a good or bad life. Now, Plato takes the idea of the judges, has them sort of seated at a table, and you come up and you basically, lay out your life, and then they make a judgment. Were you a good person or a bad person? The people who are mentioned here were punished. Titius tried to rape Hera, so he gets tortured. Let me correct that. Titius tried to rape Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, and he is in the underworld. He is strapped out, and vultures are eating at his liver. Tantalus was a guy who was so lucky that the gods came to his house for barbecue. And then one day he decided to test them by chopping up his son and serving him as barbecued meat to the gods. They recognized what it was. They didn't eat. But Demeter, who was distracted, ate a little bit. The kid was reconstructed, but they had to give him an artificial shoulder because that was the part that Demeter had eaten some of. And Tantalus, because of this awful thing, when he dies, he is put in a like a river basin or a lake basin that appears to be full up to his neck, but when he bends over, when he starts to bend so he can drink some of the water goes away. There are fruit trees that are hanging with their fruit right above his head, but when he reaches for them, the branches move away. So he's always tantalized by hunger and thirst. Sisyphus was a clever guy who he knew he was going to die. Somehow he knew like when he was going to die. So what he did is he told his wife, when I die, which is going to happen soon, don't do any of the stuff you're supposed to do towards my burial. Then when he goes to the underworld, this guy was a king, so he's pretty well known even in the underworld, and the Hades is like, dude, your wife didn't like do any of the stuff she's supposed to do. What's going on? He goes, yeah, I told that woman all the stuff she was supposed to do, and she didn't listen to me. Can I go back and yell at her? And Hades lets him go back, and when he goes back, he refuses to go back to the underworld. Of course, he does, die a little, sometime after that, but he gets to live an extended life. And Sisyphus' job in the underworld, he's given this job, he has to push a boulder up a hill. But when he gets to the top of the hill, it rolls back down again. So he can never complete the task, therefore he can never leave, right? So it's an idea of like, give him a job that he can never complete and therefore never leave. It was believed that what you did could affect the fortunes of your descendants. Oedipus's family, Oedipus's sons and daughters, things end badly for them. Some are heroic, some are not heroic, but it doesn't end well for them. And part of that's sort of the sin of the fathers visited on the children. Now there were other views about the fate of the soul. There were some philosophical movements, Epicureanism was one, that did not believe in an afterlife. When you died, your soul was just an immaterial part of your body. When your body decayed and sort of fell apart, so did your soul. It just sort of wafted into the breeze. So there was no afterlife, therefore there was no punishment, therefore you don't have to worry about that. Now, some people see that as the Epicureans were preaching that you could do whatever you wanted because it didn't matter. They were not. You should live a good life, but you should live a good life to live a good life, not because you're afraid of the afterlife, because that's stupid, right? That's really what they were saying about the afterlife. Stoics believed in an afterlife, but your soul, it rejoined the sun. It became part of the sun, so there was no personal afterlife. So in those ones, it to some extent, it doesn't really, like what you do in your life is not going to be visited by a judgment at the end. Mystery religions, these are religions that only initiates know the whole story. To other people, it remains a mystery, hence the name. And mystery religions generally preach some form of personal salvation in the afterlife. So the Eleusinian mysteries preached that basically the followers of Demeter and Persephone, right, at the Eleusinian mysteries, they had an in the afterlife, right? They had Persephone who had their back in the afterlife, which was different than anyone else. Everyone else might have a sort of mediocre or crappy afterlife. They would have a better afterlife because they had connections. The funerary rituals. There were 3 stages to the burial. First, there was the prosthesis, which was the laying out of the dead, right? So this would be similar to our wake, right? So the body would be prepared by women who would clean the body and so forth and set it out for viewing. Obviously, they have no way to preserve bodies, so this doesn't last very long. This is a sort of short period because the body's going to start stinking after a while. There is an ekphora, a funeral procession. Here, the body is being accompanied to where it will be cremated or buried, and then there is a feast at the gravesite, and then that feast is sort of held, or something similar is held, every year in honor of the dead, because the idea, if you believe in an afterlife, you believe that there are ghosts. The ghosts have to be kept happy, right? You do not want angry ghosts because that does not end well. And then heroes were exceptional people. They're going to be really upset if you don't remember them and honor them. So you had to there were shrines at their grave sites or wherever they died sometimes. And some, like Hercules, had shrines all over the place. But again, the point is you want a blessing from the dead, not a curse. So women oversaw death processes and funeral rituals. Women were in charge of sort of the stuff of the house, and this was seen, I guess, as something of that, right? This was a cleanup operation, and so it was part of their job. Men don't, I think, want to deal with that stuff, and so again, who get the dirty jobs? Often women, and this is a case there. It brought a certain honor to women for the ancients, as well. But women, of course, are seen as sort of reflected in Persephone and Demeter, who are both goddesses. This is something of the laying out of dead, and in your book you may see this better on this slide here. This is not so great. Demeter is the sister of Zeus and the mother by Zeus of Persephone, who is also called Kore, or the maiden. There is a person named Triptolemus who was something of a Johnny Appleseed. He seemed to have taken the idea of agricultural means of producing food and traveled around the Greek world sharing this. So it's sort of like Johnny Appleseed with apples in the American past. There were agricultural rituals. There was one called the proerosia, which means before plowing, where you would sort of maybe get the instruments blessed or get the ground blessed, so that you have a good harvest. There was also a festival called the Fields, or the Haloa. This was an all-female festival. It was body in character. A lot of these festivals that deal with life and death have this body element. So basically they're telling dirty jokes and stuff at these. This is all women. So the women are basically like let loose. The women go wild. And there is this sense of a connection between agriculture, right? You're planting seeds, things are coming forth, and human reproduction, right? The seed is planted, out comes a baby. And so the fertility of the earth, fertility of the women are seen as equated. And again, the sexual jokes are sort of part of that. So here we have Triptolemus in a chariot that's winged. There's this, well, it's not even sort of a chariot. There's a snake underneath it. The snake, of course, is connected to the underworld and is, he goes underground, but he also comes above ground. So there's that connection between the two planes. He's seated on what looks like a tripod that's atop a wheel. It's almost like a unicycle, and it's got wings. And he's holding grain. So he's sort of spreading the gospel of wheat. The Thesmophoria was a ritual that was held in Athens. It was an all-female ritual that occurred before sowing. And Demeter was the patron goddess of this ritual, so she was the one that they were looking to. But under the title of Demeter Thesmophoros, Demeter who brings the laws. And those might have been laws of agriculture, but also, in a sense, ancient societies were tied to settled communities which agriculture made possible, right? If you don't have agriculture, what you have is nomads who travel around because they basically have to get food through other means, through hunting or capturing people and getting their money and using that to get stuff. It was a 3-day festival. The first day was called the Anodos, the ascent. This is a departure from their family, so they go off as a female community together. The second day was the fast, the Nestia. And then the third day, which seems to have allowed men to join, was called Kalagenia, beautiful births. This was the breaking of the fast of the second day. So it was a big feast, probably some sexual activity, and my guess is there were a lot of people who were born 9 months after this festival in Athens. In the second day, the fasting day, you would dig it, in the ground there was a laying of sort of seed mixed with um, a pig that had been slain the year before was dug up. Its remains were sort of mixed with seed, which was supposed to sort of fertilize that seed. So there's this sort of sympathetic magic of life and death combined, and of the fertilization of the earth by the death of this pig. Um, the Eleusinian Mysteries. Now, there are some there were some scholarly groups, and there are some scholarly groups that believe that true mythology is directly tied to ritual. If it's not directly tied to a ritual in some way, it's not really true myth. It's a story. It still has a moral. It still has all the other stuff that myth has, but that a real myth is tied directly to ritual. This can best be seen in Greek myth with the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which is clearly a script for the Eleusinian Mystery. It's not that, in other words, a lot of the stuff in it was acted out over the course of the 9-day festival. In the story of the Homeric hymn to Demeter, this is Homeric hymn number 2, Hades abducts Persephone at the beginning of the poem. Demeter, hears her daughter's voice or is aware something's wrong, and she goes looking but can't find her. She meets with Hecate, who is this underworld sort of figure who lives in caves. And Hecate says she heard Demeter scream, but she didn't know exactly what happened. Then Hecate and Demeter travel to Helios, the sun god, and they ask him, because he has a bird's eye view of everything, if he saw what happened. He says, yes, what happened was Zeus made an arrangement with Hades, and Hades took Persephone as a bride. He is sympathetic to Demeter, but he also tells Demeter that she shouldn't be overly concerned because, Hades is a pretty good catch as a son-in-law. Right, so he's sympathetic, but he also has the male point of view that, hey, this is what happens. Women get married, and to some extent, married might be seen as a sort of attack on their virginity, but that's what are you going to do, right? And at least this guy's pretty good. Demeter wanders after she hears this. She's in total despair. She wanders around and she ends up at Eleusis, which is a town about 14 miles from Athens. Basically, think of like Independence, Missouri. It's close enough. It's it's a little bit closer than that, but it's its own city, but it's really close. You could walk to downtown Independence from downtown Kansas City. It might be a tough walk. It's not an impossible walk. And the same thing with the Eleusinian Mysteries. There was some part of it that took place in Athens, and then there was a day where you traveled by walking to Eleusis. And ancient Greeks, of course, were in much better shape, so of course they were able to make that trip. But still, they're close enough. And while she's there, she takes care of the baby, the king's son, and tries to make him a god by burning away his immortality. Each night she puts him in the fire, and his mortality burns off slowly. But one night, mom can't sleep, and she goes into the great hall of the palace and sees this. And of course, she sees her baby in the fire, so she freaks out. Demeter is shocked and grabs the baby, takes the baby out of the fire, and then basically throws him on the ground and says, you don't know what you did. You basically wrecked everything. And then says, the kid's going to grow up. The kid's going to be fine. He's going to live a long life. He's going to be, in quite great shape for a long time, but he will die, right? So you took that away from him. Then she demands that the temple be built, that the Eleusinian Mysteries be started, and all that other stuff. And that's sort of how the poem sort of ends with her making that demand, and then with Zeus realizing that nothing's growing. If nothing grows, there can't be any sacrifices, and humans will die. It's going to be bad for everyone. And so then he sends Hermes down to Hades and says, you got to let Persephone go. Persephone is given some pomegranate seeds, which either she just eats or she is forced to eat. Depends on the version. But at any rate, she eats these pomegranate seeds, and that means that she's eaten some in the underworld. She can't come back from that. There was a week-long festival of the Eleusinian Mysteries that lasted for 9 days. It took place at the end of September by our reckoning, and the months of September and October were there was no warfare. There was always a truce for those 2 months to allow people, because any Greek speaker, including Romans, right, who could speak Greek, could come to the Eleusinian Mysteries. And so if, for instance, you had Sparta and Athens at war with one another, as you did, or Thebes and Sparta at war with Athens, or whatever, during that time, any of those Greek speakers could come to Athens and Eleusis to participate in the mysteries. Participation was voluntary. It was personal. You had to have a sponsor. So it's sort of like in the Catholic Church, you have to have a sponsor when you get confirmed. That's a purely pro forma thing in the Catholic Church. I'm guessing it was a little more personal in the Greek world. Someone you knew who was already an initiate would sponsor you and then help you through those that first time through the ritual. This is a picture of Iambe, who is also called Baubo. She is naked and sitting atop a pig. The pig, by the way, was a slang term for the female naughty bits down under. And so this figure of Iambe or Baubo, Iambe is this working girl servant in the palace of Celeus and Eleusis, the one where Demeter is. Demeter is depressed because of her, the loss of her daughter, and Iambe tells her jokes which get her laughing. Well, Iambe tells her dirty jokes which get her laughing. It doesn't say that, but the name Iambe is like iambic poetry. In the ancient world, iambic poetry is basically insult poetry and naughty poetry. So presumably the jokes that she told to Demeter were dirty jokes, and that gets her laughing. And so this was also part of the Eleusinian Mysteries. The initiates, the mustai, were sponsored by previous initiates. The festival begins in Athens, and there are 4 days in Athens. The last day you could show up and participate in the particular rituals was the 4th day. So if you showed up on the last day in Athens, you could still participate. If you showed up on the 5th day, the people have already left for Eleusis. They're on their way to Eleusis. You could not join at that part. And this seemed to be just to allow more people to join. Remember, travel would have been tough if you're coming from Sicily to Athens, and you have to wait for the beginning of that truce period because Sicily was associated with Sparta. So if Sparta and Athens are at war, people from Syracuse are not going to travel all the way to Athens when they might be captured, right? So they're going to be careful about when they travel. So maybe the 4 days seemed to be to allow for that. But there was a myth connected to it that Hercules showed up once and he wanted to participate, and no one's going to say no to Hercules, and he showed up on day 4. On the trip to Eleusis, each initiate carried a torch as if they were looking for Persephone. They crossed a river called the Cephisus River. Rivers in the ancient world were not big rivers. Rivers in the Greek world were not big rivers. They were pretty small rivers. This is in the fall, so they're getting bigger, but they're not dry like they might be in the summer. But they're still likely small. And the Cephisus would be a small river, even by Greek standards. So you could walk across it well enough. So when you get there, there were people there who wore masks and basically would hurl naughty insults at you. So like basically they're yelling yo mama jokes or something at these people as they're traveling to Eleusis. And again, what's that all about? Well, there seems to be connection between life and death and sexuality is connected with this naughty humor. So there's an arrival at Eleusis that happens in the 6th day, and there's something that happens outside there. Then the 7th and 8th day, there's something inside the telesterion, which was this enclosed place. And presumably, when you went into it, the room would have been totally dark because there would not have been windows, and torches would be lit at certain points. But you're basically in darkness for a certain period of time. There's also the fasting that took place, and the time that you traveled to Eleusis, you were fasting that day, so you're really hungry and thirsty. And one of the things you're given at Eleusis on day 6 and maybe on day 7 is you're given some sort of grain brew, right? Remember, the Greeks generally drank wine, but for this they drank a fermented grain beverage, so something like a beer or an ale. And it may have had some sort of hallucinogenic properties in it, we don't know. But at any rate, if you haven't been eating for a while, then you drink something, then you're in a dark room and you start hearing sounds and stuff, it's going to be pretty spooky, right? It's going to have an effect on you. And then when someone lights a torch and makes some sort of proclamation, it's going to be really moving. It'll have an effect, no doubt. So we don't know what happened for sure at the telesterion. There was supposedly some revelation. But, Clement of Alexandria makes a statement, and he says what it was someone held up a sheaf of wheat and said, behold, this is life, or something like that. And he thought that was stupid. But in the Christian Mass, right, Clement of Alexandria was a Christian. In the Christian Mass, the Catholic Mass, which would have been the type of Mass that Clement would have had, the priest holds up a wafer of wheat and says, this is my body, take thou and eat. So again, this seems like the pot calling the kettle black for a Christian to be suggesting that holding up wheat and saying, look at the wheat, and that having a profound effect is somehow stupid. We don't know. There were scholarly debates over what happened. We just don't know. But people who participate in the Eleusinian mysteries say it changed their life. This was, for the Greeks, the born-again experience, right? The people who did this, it apparently moved them a lot. It sort of changed their way of thinking about life and about death. And it might have been the idea that they're going to have a better afterlife because they have a connection in the afterlife. But whatever it was, people came away changed, and apparently mostly changed for the better. I already summarized the Homeric hymn to Demeter, so I'm not going to re-summarize that now. This is what's left of the telesterion. So you can see these benches. This would be where initiates would sit. This would have been roofed over, so it would have been a fairly large space, but it would have been a fairly dark space. I mean, my guess is you had torches to get in, but then the torches were extinguished. I mean, otherwise you're walking around in the dark, and that, with clearly there are some columns to keep the roof up, you'd be bumping into stuff. So, but it's a pretty good sized, building. The theory for this chapter deals with a piece by Helene Foley, who is a classicist who largely deals with women's issues. So a couple things. The figure of Euhemerus is mentioned. So Euhemerus was a Greek author in much later than the Homeric works and the Homeric hymns, and Euhemerus claimed that he traveled to some island, and on that island there were statues of what looked like great heroes, and he looked at their names and he saw they were Zeus and Apollo and Hermes and so, and his conclusion was that the Greek gods were not actually gods, but they were humans who, through mythology, had been sort of elevated to gods, right? So that's So it's an attempt to take myth and to rationalize it. Now, there were some authors, Johann Jakob Bachofen felt that there had been a Greek matriarchy that preceded the Indo-Europeans. The Indo-Europeans were definitely a patriarchal society. They were a nomadic warrior society. So obviously men are going to have the upper hand in that sort of society. But there is some archaeological evidence to suggest that goddesses had a higher role prior to that Indo-European invasion. Now, whether it was a matriarchy where women are in charge or not, goddesses seem to have been more elevated prior to the Indo-European invasion. Feminist scholarship picks this up in the 20th century. People like Maria Gimbutas, also would pick this up. Now, the idea with the feminist scholarship was prior to patriarchy sort of wrecking things, there had been a peaceful society of cooperation where people are all on the same level rather than a hierarchical system such as you have in Indo-European society, right? In a patriarchal society, men are in charge. Women might have support roles, but they are not in charge. They're not calling the shots. Now, the world we live in is still a patriarchal society, but there are a lot more women in positions of power. So, it's a lot more fluid. Ancient Greek women had no legal rights. They couldn't own property. The men in their lives really owned the property, and the men could dispose of it as they wished. They didn't need to necessarily consult the women. Greek women, when they got married, the husband to be and the father of the bride worked out some sort of deal. The daughter might have some input, but didn't have to. The mother might have some input, but didn't have to, which is why the story of Demeter and Persephone, they don't get a say. Hades and Zeus make the deal. Hades gets her as a bride, and even though he doesn't get her for the full time because she ate some seeds, so she has to return to the underworld every year, but she only ate, in some versions, 3 seeds, in some versions 6 seeds, so either for 3 months or half the year, but the rest of the time she's with mom, so it's not a total victory for either side, but it is a victory ultimately for patriarchy because, Persephone is not free. She's not free to do what she wants. Now, this writing, the 1950s on, there was a lot of this stuff being written, and then of course when the feminist movement really took off in the 60s and 70s, this really was huge, and people took it as gospel that prior to the Indo-Europeans, Greece had been a peaceful land, it had been agricultural, everyone got along, it was under, women had, power and authority, and they were rulers. There is no real evidence of that. And Helene Foley's piece, her article here, is basically not an attack on that idea, because she is herself a feminist, and she does believe in, women having equal rights. What she says is there's no evidence that the ancient stories show that there had been a time prior to the Indo-European like that this hymn reflects. And there are counter arguments that can be found within the poem. And she argues that one of the chief purposes of Homeric hymn number 2 is for women to accept the patriarchal rules of marriage, because remember, ancient Greek marriage, the groom and dad worked out a deal. The woman was really sort of what the deal was about, but she doesn't really have a say. And so I think some dads probably let their daughter have some input. I think if they were smart, they held their power lightly, and they didn't sort of force it, but they were under no legal obligation. And so women are basically, they have to accept this situation. There is no other choice, right? Women who don't accept the situation are outcast. They're outside the society. So what are you going to do? And that this poem, by showing what happens to Persephone, yes, Persephone's kidnapping is awful. She's screaming, she's hollering, she's terrified. Demeter is in depression for a full year over this whole thing until she finally gets her daughter sprung for at least some of the year. It's tough. It's tough for both the mom and for the daughter in these societies. But women within these societies get to be moms. They get to participate in the upbringing of their kids. So they do have some say there. They do have some control and some power within the house. They don't have it outside the house, but within the house they have some power, and they've got status, right? So married women are sort of looked up to, and so they have some status. And that's what women get out of it. That's why women should take the deal. And Foley argues that you can read that in this poem, that's part of the message. Here we have Demeter, Triptolemus, and Persephone. Triptolemus here, not uncommon in Greek art, is naked. He's clearly a youth, he appears to be a youth. He's not bearded. The goddesses may be physically larger than him, so just because they are gods and he is human, but. The comparison piece deals with the figure of Ishtar and her descent. And so this poem is going to be difficult for you to read. It's difficult to know exactly what's going on. But Mesopotamia is the land between the two rivers, and the Sumerians were there. They were conquered by the Akkadians. So there had been a goddess named Inanna, who was a Sumerian goddess. The Akkadian Ishtar and Inanna are roughly the same figure. The Sumerian stories were then written down in Akkadian, and the versions we have of Gilgamesh and the other are in Akkadian. They're not in Sumerian. We do have some Sumerian documents, but they are, I don't know if we have much literature that is Sumerian. What we have are the Akkadian versions of those stories. And even though you had Sumerian and Akkadian is easier to read than Sumerian. The belief system and the myths, were sort of shared between. They were two separate people, but they ultimately have the same stories. Ishtar is a goddess of war, fertility, beauty, sexuality. In some cities, the king's consort. So there would be a ritual, maybe an annual ritual, where the king mates with a priestess who represents the embodiment of Ishtar. That doesn't always work out. Ishtar tries to get Gilgamesh to mate with her. He refuses. It turns out very badly for Gilgamesh's friend. She does have a young lover named Dumuzi, sometimes called Tammuz, Tammuz, sometimes called Damu, so it can be any of those things. In this poem, and here we've got some, this is a cylinder that leaves an impression, so this would be to make a wax seal. In the poem that we have, The Descent of Ishtar, Ishtar is traveling to the underworld. Her sister, Ereshkigal, seems to hate Ishtar and doesn't want her to come, and she's coming anyways. It is unclear why she is coming. The most likely explanation is that she is coming, as Ereshkigal expects, to conquer the underworld, which of course Ereshkigal does not want. And so there are gates that Ishtar has to go through. At each gate to get through, she has to give up part of her clothing. And when she goes through the seventh gate, she has given up everything, and she is naked and powerless and stuck in the underworld. So Ereshkigal has not kidnapped Ishtar. Ishtar came to the underworld, but she is now trapped in the underworld, and animals are not mating with one another. Nothing's growing, right? Basically, it's the same sort of situation as we have in the Persephone story. And the gods get together and say, we need to do something about this. And so they create this handsome guy who's going to go down and sort of seduce Ereshkigal and get him to free Ishtar. Ultimately, Ishtar is freed. And in the usual account, what happens is Dumuzi apparently was not sufficiently grieving for Ishtar's departure, and therefore she decides that he can take her place in the underworld. And so Dumuzi then shares time between Ereshkigal and above ground with Ishtar. So is sort of like split in jobs, and that's sort of the deal that they work out. So it's Dumuzi who ends up taking the punishment, so that Ishtar can be around, because you need people to get together, you need animals to get together, you need plants to come forth, or else the whole thing stops. So we've largely done this. So we talked about good looks. Dumuzi is an example of a dying and rising god. He would be somewhat like Persephone. Persephone goes to the underworld, but she comes back every year. Dumuzi serves that purpose in the Mesopotamian account. Ishtar, of course, does not sort of die. I mean, she's a top-line goddess, so she can't really sort of stay in the underworld. The Nachleben section, the reception is looks at one poem, a poem by Rita Dove called "The Narcissus Flower." Persephone in the Homeric hymn to Demeter does not really have a say. She only really says two things. She cries out, we don't find out her exact words, when Hades kidnaps her. She's yelling when he's dragging her. When the earth closes over them, she stops yelling, but she's yelling while she can still see the sky. And then she tells her mom that Hades forced her to eat the pomegranate seeds. When it's described, it sounds like he slipped her the seeds, or he, convinced her to take the seeds. Doesn't sound like it sounds like more of a seduction, not an attack. But that's not what she tells her mom. But that's the only thing we get. And by the way, the bit about eating pomegranate seeds is not really about pomegranate seeds. That seems to be like a code for they had sex. So once she has sex with Hades, she's basically then part of a couple with him and can no longer be just her mother's daughter, right? So that's what that's sort of all about. And we don't find out what Persephone's desire is. There is a hint, as I said, that there might be a more mutual agreement for the two to mate, right, when she takes the pomegranate seeds. In the first account of it, when she tells her mom, she might just be trying to provide cover for herself. She doesn't want to admit to her mom that she has sexual desire for Hades. After all, Hades really sort of upset mom, so basically saying, well, I sort of dig the guy, is not actually going to play well, so that it might be for that purpose. But modern authors, especially women poets, have written poems about Persephone where they give Persephone a voice. And some authors, it's her desire to be with Hades. Mom is basically a strangle on her. And if you think of 20th and 21st century women, right? They go away to college, and then basically they're largely living on their own. They may be living with someone in a sexual relation or not, and then they may or may not get married, or at least be in a committed relationship. They generally the idea is you don't want to be really going back home. You still love mom, and you stay in contact with mom, but there's definitely this desire to get out. And there are some poets who take that point of view that, mom thought Hades was a monster, but actually he's a pretty nice guy, and I'm actually glad to be with him because mom was driving me crazy, right? So that is a possible thing. That's not the approach Rita Dove takes in The Narcissus Flower. It's a short poem, but if you are likely to have some sort of flashback, if you've ever been the victim of sexual assault, you might want to skip reading the poem itself. But it describes, basically she sees her own sexual assault, the assault on her when she was a student. She's been a poet much of her life, and she's quite attractive. When she lived in Paris, among other things, she was a model for artists. So she would have been painted nude. One of the artists took advantage of that situation, and that had a profound effect on Rita Dove. Obviously, she can't forget that. I mean, she may have grown past it in some ways, but she can't forget that. And I imagine that's true for everyone who's suffered sexual assault. It never goes away. It's always going to be there. Any traumatic thing, you take that trauma with you. You can deal with it, but it never goes. And so she remembers the moment of the actual attack, which is sort of reflected as what happens with Persephone when she looks at the narcissus flower. She falls in love with it, and that's when Hades comes out and grabs her. So this is more a reflection on what happens to Rita Dove using the Persephone story. But there are, as I said, other versions where Persephone is given a voice, where she keeps a little diary, and in the underworld, and her view is a more positive one. So there are different ways to look at this situation, and we'll see, chapter 5 next time. This is a picture, by the way, of Persephone, done on paper, and part of the paper has been, scuffed up. So you get this sense of like Persephone sort of fading away or dissolving. So it's a quite impressive little piece. It's a 20th century piece, obviously.